The Unveiling had never failed. Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey had watched it work on 11 worlds, in 11 systems, against 11 species who had never seen a Virsy hull before and would, within the hour, never forget one. The sequence took 4 minutes and 11 seconds, was performed in perfect synchrony by every ship in the Ashfall Armada, and ended, without exception, in surrender. It was beginning its 12th performance when the human corvette started laughing. Not screaming, not broadcasting a distress call or a plea, or the ritual admissions of terror that the resonance dirge was built across 3 centuries to extract. Laughing, a ragged, disbelieving, entirely human sound that rolled out of the tiny ship's open comm channel and filled the flagship's bridge before anyone thought to cut the feed. Ossenrahk's mandibles stopped mid-click. Around her, 40 bridge officers who had spent their careers perfecting the choreography of dread went very, very still. "Report," she said, and her voice box modulated the word into something with an edge she did not usually need. Vessel reader Thome, 3 seats down at the sensor well, had his primary eye fixed on the readout and his secondary eye fixed on nothing at all, the pale inner lid sliding shut the way it did when a Virsy mind needed a moment before it could speak. "Marshal, the vessel is transmitting an audio response to the Unveiling." Translation matrix confirms genuine amusement. Confidence, 91%. "They are amused. They are laughing, Marshal, at us." The Unveiling continued behind them on the main display, indifferent to the fact that its audience had stopped being afraid. Ship by ship, down the 7-kilometer length of the Ashfall Armada, weapon housings rotated open in the slow, terrible cascade that had broken the will of 11 civilizations before a single shot had ever been fired. The resonance dirge, the low, grieving moan that every Virsy hull's hull throat was built to produce, tuned across generations to strike something ancient and helpless in whatever species heard it, rolled out across the dead space between the Armada and the single defending ship. On the human corvette, that grieving moan came out of a jury-rigged translation array as a long, descending, comically strangled honk, like a horn losing its air. Nobody on the flagship knew that yet. All they knew was the laughter and that it would not stop. "Cut audio pickup," Ossenrahk said. "Cut it now." The channel died. The bridge exhaled in that specific tight-jointed way Virsy bodies exhaled when they had been holding still for too long, all 400 of them doing it in near unison. And for one moment Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey, undefeated in 11 campaigns, the youngest marshal to hold an Armada command in 140 years, decorated 3 times for engagements that had ended before they began, felt something she had genuinely never felt in the field. She felt confused. The Unveiling was older than the Ashfall Dominion itself, older, in fact, than any single Virsy alive. It had been born 3 centuries earlier out of the last war the Virsy had ever fought against an enemy who did not surrender, a grinding, decades-long conflict against the core ascendancy that had cost the Virsy homeworld 2 of its 3 continents, and had ended, finally, not because either side ran out of ships, but because a young weapons-cast engineer named Ashfall had built a broadcast array capable of reproducing, at fleet scale, the specific pressure wave frequencies that triggered instinctive dread in nearly every species, with a nervous system built along convergent evolutionary lines. It had ended the core war in a single afternoon. It had ended 11 wars since, each one faster than the last, until the Ashfall Dominion had stopped needing to fight wars at all and started simply arriving, and unveiling, and receiving surrender the way weather received acknowledgement, not as a victory to be earned, but as a fact to be accepted. Ossenrahk had grown up on stories of the Unveiling the way human children grew up on stories of sunrise. It did not fail. It had never failed. The entire architecture of the Dominion's diplomacy, its economy, its self-image as a species that had transcended the wastefulness of war, rested on the unbroken fact of its success. The Unveiling finished its sequence. Every gun on every ship sat open and gleaming, aimed at a single corvette barely a tenth the mass of the flagship alone. On any of the 11 worlds, this was the moment the surrender came, a trembling voice, a lowered weapon, a species learning in real time what it meant to be small. Instead, the human vessel's transponder blinked once, cheerfully, and sent a text-only reply that the translation matrix rendered without editorializing, because it did not know how. Unknown vessel, that was genuinely the funniest thing we've seen all year. Do it again. Also, please don't come any closer. We have a mining laser, and we are not afraid to use it on something that expensive. Ossenrahk read it twice. "Thome," she said. "Tell me about the mining laser." 3 minutes earlier, on a ship a tenth the mass of the flagship, and roughly a 40th as clean, Lieutenant Commander Dax Aoyama had been lying on his back under the No. 2 coolant manifold with a wrench in his teeth when the proximity alarm went off. And his first genuine thought, before the tactical thought, before the command thought, before any thought that belonged to the 29-year-old officer technically in charge of the Terran defense ship Coldwater, had been, "Not again." He was out from under the manifold before the second alarm cycle finished, boots skidding on deck plate that had been resurfaced twice in 18 months, because the original plating had been salvage stock to begin with. And by the time he hit the command chair, the main display had already resolved the contact into something that made his stomach drop through the floor. "That's not a ship," said Petty Officer Second Class Marisol Reyes, from tactical in the flat voice of someone doing math she did not like the answer to. "That's a fleet. That's, sir, that's a lot of fleet." "Define a lot." 211 hulls. Biggest ones got a mass signature bigger than the whole Coldwater station complex. They just dropped out of whatever they were doing to get here that fast, and sir, they are lighting up like it's a parade. Dax looked at the display for exactly as long as it took to confirm Reyes wasn't exaggerating, then keyed the ship wide. "All hands, general quarters, this is not a drill. I say again, this is not a drill." He didn't sound as calm as he wanted to. Nobody who'd been assigned to the Coldwater ever quite managed calm on the first alarm. It was the later alarms that got easy. Outpost Calder's Reach had 11 residents, a mining concession on a rock nobody important cared about, and 1 ship. The Coldwater, a corvette so far past its service life that its own manufacturer had stopped answering requisition requests for parts 8 years ago. Its crew of 6 had not been picked for competence. They had been picked because nobody wanted them, 6 officers, and enlisted whose service records were, in one way or another, too colorful for a posting anyone cared about, dumped together on the rim by a personnel system that had run out of patience and decided the rim could absorb the mess. Which was how a corvette with a cracked coolant line, a translation array rebuilt from a decommissioned entertainment console, and a chief engineer who had once been court-martialed for modifying a training simulator without authorization, came to be the entire defense of a human border claim against something that had just unfolded 211 warships like a bad dream. Reyes had been a rising star in Fleet Tactical, 3 years into a career track that put her on a carrier bridge by 30. Until she'd filed a formal report on a training command captain who liked to shout at junior officers until they cried, and the report had gone nowhere except onto her own record as difficult to work with. Petty Officer Third Class Amos Guthrie, down in the reactor room right now with his ear against a pipe that had no business still holding pressure, had washed out of 2 other postings for the same offense every time, telling a superior officer correctly that a plan was going to get someone killed. Corpsman D. Alvarez had transferred here voluntarily, the only one who had, because a training accident on her last ship had put her in the position of choosing who got the last of the emergency oxygen, and she had chosen right, and nobody on that ship had ever been able to look at her the same way again. Signals specialist Tomas Rake had been the entertainment console technician the Coldwater had inherited by accident when his repair contract ran out the same week the ship's original translation array finally died for good. And he had simply never left, because nobody else on the Reach could keep the jury-rigged system running, and he had, somewhere in the last 2 years, stopped thinking of it as a job and started thinking of it as his. None of them had asked to be here. All of them, in one way or another, had been people who told the truth at the wrong moment, or made the hard call and lived with it, or simply refused to stop fixing something everyone else had already given up on. Dax had stopped thinking of the Coldwater as a punishment posting somewhere around month 4, when he'd realized that every person on it had been sent here specifically because they did not know how to quit. "Sir," that was Chief Petty Officer Priya Nazari, ship's engineer, sliding into the seat beside him with grease still fresh on her knuckles and her expression doing something complicated. "Sir, I need you to look at the sensor feed, specifically the lights show." He looked. Across the enemy formation, gun housings were rotating open in a long, rolling wave, ship after ship after ship, all perfectly timed, all sweeping in the same slow, cascading rhythm. A sound was coming with it. His console flagged an incoming transmission, translated it, and played the result over the bridge speakers. A long, mournful, descending honk, like a foghorn dying of embarrassment. There was a silence on the Coldwater's bridge that lasted exactly 1.5 seconds. Then Reyes made a sound like she was trying not to sneeze, failed, and the whole bridge went. Dax would spend the rest of his career trying to explain to people who hadn't been there why it happened, and none of the explanations ever quite landed, because you had to have sat through the thing itself. You had to have been a cadet at Cold Harbor Academy 9 years earlier, in Combat Simulator Bay 4, running the notorious Scenario 9, the one every instructor kept in rotation, because it was, technically, the single most theatrically overdesigned threat profile in the training library, an AI opponent that unfolded its weapons in a slow, synchronized ripple across 200 simulated hulls while broadcasting a mournful two-tone dirge specifically engineered. According to the simulator's own design notes leaked years earlier by a disgruntled contractor, to trigger maximum primal dread with minimum production cost. Generations of cadets had nicknamed it the Doom Wave. Keeping a straight face through the Doom Wave had become an unofficial rite of passage, a hazing ritual instructors quietly encouraged, because watching 18-year-olds try not to laugh while a doom horn played was, apparently, the funniest thing available to a bored simulator staff. And here it was, in real space, performed with total sincerity by something with 211 actual warships, aimed at 11 miners and a corvette held together with hope. It was, Dax reflected, watching his tactical officer wipe her eyes, absolutely the funniest thing that had ever tried to kill him. "Okay," he said when he could talk again, wiping his own face with the back of his hand. "Okay, Reyes, send them something, keep it short." "Sorry." "I mean it, tell them it was funny. Tell them not to come any closer, tell them we've got the mining laser primed." It wasn't, not yet, but Nazari was already moving toward engineering at a dead run, which meant it would be soon, and tell them, I don't know, tell them to do it again. "You want me to compliment the Doomsday Fleet. I want them to keep talking to us instead of shooting. And right now the only card in our hand is that apparently nobody's ever laughed at them before. So yeah. Compliment the Doomsday Fleet." On the flagship, Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey had commanded her chief linguist to run the human transmission through 4 separate translation protocols, and all 4 had returned some variation of the same impossible sentence. They were not afraid, they found the display entertaining, and they were asking for an encore. "This is a stalling tactic," said Battle Reader Corvine, her second in command, a Virsey of the old military caste whose chitin had gone the deep bronze of long service. "They're transmitting confusion to buy time. It's a known human strategy. We've seen it in the intercepted records from the Threll border wars. Feign incompetence, disarm the aggressor's confidence, strike while. The Threll border wars were fought against a species that had encountered humans for 6 years and studied nothing but their military doctrine, Ossenrahk said. This outpost has no fleet presence, no defensive works beyond that single vessel, and a civilian mining concession attached to it. If this is a stalling tactic, Corvette, it is the strangest one in the history of stalling tactics, because they appear to genuinely find us funny. She did not say the other thing, the thing sitting cold and unfamiliar in the space behind her mandibles, that in 11 campaigns, the Unveiling's dirge had never once failed to land as it was designed to land, and that watching it fail now, against a single corvette that should by every metric have been the easiest surrender of her career, had put something in her chest she did not have a word for in her own language. She would learn the human word for it later. Unsettled. Send the Vanguard, she said instead, 1 scout cruiser. I want that ship disabled, not destroyed. I want to know what is on it, and I want the surrender protocol run properly this time, in person, by someone who can watch their faces when reality catches up to them. Corvin's antennae dipped in acknowledgement, and the scout cruiser 9th Silence peeled off from the formation and began its approach. They're sending one, Reyes called out, 20 minutes later, when the Coldwater's crew had used the pause to do exactly nothing productive except argue about whether the mining laser could actually be repurposed as a weapon. A question Nazari answered by disappearing into the cargo hold with a torch, and coming back 40 minutes later covered in soot and grinning in a way Dax had learned to be specifically afraid of. 1 ship, Dax said. Out of 211. 1 ship, sir. Big one though, cruiser class, maybe 4 times our mass. Better odds than 211. He didn't feel as steady as the joke sounded. Nazari, talk to me. Priya Nazari wiped her hands on a rag that had been white sometime in the previous decade, and pulled up a schematic on the shared display. Outpost Calder's reach wasn't much, but it had 6 years of mining infrastructure scattered across the asteroid belt it sat in, and Nazari had spent every one of those years finding creative uses for equipment that was never designed to be creative. The Reach has 41 active mining drones on tethers, working the belt on autopilot most of the time because we don't have the crew to run them by hand. Each one's got a directional charge for breaking up ore bodies. Not a weapon, not remotely a weapon, but it's a shaped charge and it's on a 2-kilometer tether, and the whole belt is crisscrossed with cable we use for hauling. You want to build a trap out of the asteroid belt. I want to build a trap out of the asteroid belt, sir, because I have been doing exactly that in my head since the day I got here, mostly out of boredom, and I never in 100 years thought I'd get to actually try it on something that deserved it. She grinned, and it was not a nice grin. That cruiser's coming in on a standard intercept vector, which means it's going to cross the Kessler field. That's what we call the densest part of the belt. It's a mess. Nobody flies through it if they can help it. If they don't know the field's there, or don't respect it because their sensors are rated for open space, and not for a few thousand years of rubble somebody's been mining chunks out of, we can pull 3 tethers taut across their vector with the drones, and when their hull hits that cable at cruising speed, it won't cut a warship in half. No, but it'll snap 3 shaped charges against their hull plating at a closing speed of about 4 kilometers a second, and even a glancing hit from that is going to take out sensor arrays, maybe an engine pod, and it is going to happen so fast and look so much like bad luck that they will have no idea we did it on purpose. She spread her hands. It's not much. But it buys time, and it makes the second ship they send a lot more careful, and careful is slower, and slower is all we've got. Dax looked at the plot for a long moment. The wandering paths of 41 drones that had never done anything more dramatic than crack open a rock, the tangled skein of cable that had never held anything heavier than ore, and felt something settle in him that he recognized from every disaster this crew had ever survived together. Not confidence, exactly. Just the specific, stubborn refusal to be the one who panicked first. "Do it," he said, "and Priya, good work. Don't thank me yet, sir. Thank me if it works." The ninth Silence crossed into the Kessler field at cruising speed with its sensors tuned for open space, exactly as Nazari had gambled, and its captain, a young Virsey officer named Second Reader Ashfall, on his first Vanguard command, handpicked by Corvin for his flawless record in 11 simulated boarding actions, felt the ship buck sideways hard enough to throw 2 of his bridge crew out of their restraints before any alarm had time to sound. By the time the alarms did sound, 3 of his outer sensor arrays were gone. A secondary engine pod was venting plasma into vacuum in a long silver plume, and the ninth Silence was tumbling, slowly, gracelessly, 3 degrees off its heading, and losing more with every second the reaction thrusters fought to compensate. "Report," Ashfall said, and heard his own voice crack on the word in a way that would have embarrassed him if he'd had the attention to spare for embarrassment. "Impact," said his sensor officer, staring at a readout that made no sense. "Multiple impacts, cable strikes, reader. We hit cable, the human mining belt. They've got tethered drones out there, and something pulled 3 of them directly into our vector at the exact moment we crossed." "That's not possible. That requires precision timing across a debris field that dense. Nothing in that outpost's registered equipment has fire control sophisticated enough to." "I don't have an explanation, reader. I have a hull breach on Deck 6 and an engine pod I can't restart." On the flagship, 6 light minutes and 1 relay away, Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey watched the telemetry come in her Vanguard ship, disabled, not by any weapon her sensors could identify, but by what her tactical analysts were calling, with visible discomfort, environmental hazard, possibly deliberate, method unclear, and felt the unfamiliar thing in her chest get a degree colder. "They didn't fire a shot," Corvin said, very quietly at her side. "No," Ossenrahk agreed. "They used their mining equipment against a warship. And it worked." "Then let us try something they cannot out-engineer," Corvin said, and there was an edge of wounded pride in it now, the specific sting of a soldier who had watched brute improvisation succeed where doctrine had failed. Intrusion reader Vesic believes the corvette's systems are vulnerable. Their translation array alone is running on consumer-grade hardware 15 years obsolete by our standards. Let us take the ship without ever crossing their debris field at all. Intrusion reader Vesic was young for her caste, brilliant by every measure the Dominion's academies used to rank such things, and she spent 40 minutes building an infiltration packet keyed to every known human military protocol the Dominion's intelligence archives held. Clean, elegant, layered 3 times against detection, designed to slip into a warship's command network the way water found a crack in stone. It found the Coldwater's network in under a minute. It found nothing in it that made sense. "Reader," her junior officer said, staring at a readout that kept resolving into contradictions, "their command network isn't running standard Terran Defense Force architecture. It's reader. It's running 6 different operating systems, none of them compatible with each other, patched together with what looks like handwritten translation code between each one. Our packet doesn't know which system to attack because there isn't one system. It's attacking all of them and none of them at once." Vesic tried a narrower approach, targeting what her archives insisted was the ship's primary reactor control, and watched her intrusion packet vanish into a subroutine that her own systems flagged, with something almost like confusion in the automated report, as non-functional legacy code, purpose unclear, appears to reference a decommissioned entertainment platform. The Coldwater's engineering network had been so many times overwritten, patched, cannibalized, and stitched back together by a chief engineer, with a genius for making incompatible things cooperate that it had, entirely by accident, become nearly impossible to model. There was no clean architecture to attack, because there had never been a clean architecture to begin with. Every elegant, doctrinally sound infiltration Vesic built shattered against a system that had been held together for 2 years by nothing but stubbornness and spare parts, and had never once been designed with an intruder's convenience in mind. Marshal, Vesic reported, 40 minutes and 6 failed intrusion attempts later, her voice carefully controlled in the way young officers used when they did not want their marshal to hear how badly they had wanted this to work. I cannot get a clean read on their systems, let alone control of them. I believe their vulnerability is that they have no coherent vulnerability. Everything on that ship is broken in a slightly different, mutually incompatible way, and I do not know how to exploit a system that was never built to be understood in the first place. Ossenrahk absorbed this without visible reaction, though something in her chest had gone colder still. 3 failures now, 3 completely different approaches, 3 outcomes that no doctrine in 300 years of Ashfall military history had prepared her officers to process. Down in the reactor room, 3 decks below the bridge and far enough from any viewport that Amos Guthrie hadn't actually seen the Ashfall Armada with his own eyes yet. The only sign anything had gone right was the fact that nobody had called down to tell him it had gone wrong. He kept working anyway, because that was the job. Keep the number in the green, keep the coolant moving, keep a reactor that had been rated for another 4 years back when somebody still made parts for it running on a diet of patched seals and stubbornness. Guthrie had learned a long time ago, 2 washed-out postings ago, specifically, both times for telling a superior officer a plan was going to get somebody killed, that the surest way to survive a crisis he couldn't see was to make absolutely certain the thing he could see kept working. "Talk to me," he said into the open comm, to nobody in particular, the way he always did when the waiting got long enough to need a voice in the room that wasn't his own thoughts. D. Alvarez's voice came back a moment later, quieter than the reactor's hum. "I'm here, doing rounds. Everybody's still breathing, which, given the day, feels like it should be a bigger accomplishment than it sounds. You check on Tomas. He's got his whole console apart. Says he wants a second relay ready in case the first one gets fried. I told him the ship would probably be fried too at that point, and he told me that was exactly why he wanted a backup translator instead of a backup ship, because at least the translator he could actually build." A pause, static soft. "He's not wrong. That's the annoying part." Guthrie almost smiled. He had spent 2 years learning to read this crew through comm static alone, since half his life aboard the Coldwater happened in a reactor room 3 decks from anyone's face, and Alvarez's voice this steady, this deliberately unbothered, was its own kind of tell. This was the voice she used when she was scared, and had decided being scared wasn't going to be the thing anyone remembered about today. "You doing okay?" he asked anyway, because someone had to ask, and it was easier to ask over a comm than across a table. "I chose the last oxygen once, Amos. I know what today could turn into. I also know what it hasn't turned into yet, which is currently 0 people dead and 1 very confused alien fleet, so." Her voice didn't waver exactly, but it thinned at the edges, the way a wire thinned right before you learned whether it would hold. "I'm doing my rounds. I'm checking my kits. If it goes bad, I want to already be moving when it does, because standing still is the only part of this job I've never been able to do." "Copy that." Guthrie checked a gauge that didn't need checking, because his hands wanted something to do that wasn't waiting. "For what it's worth, whatever's coming, I'd rather be down here with a coolant line I understand than up there guessing what a war marshal's thinking. Simple problems. I like simple problems. You built half this reactor's containment out of parts from 3 different decommissioned haulers. I wouldn't call that simple." "It's simple to me. That's the part that counts." Up on the bridge, Dax had given the order to stand easy for exactly as long as it took the enemy to decide what came next, which in practice meant every console stayed lit, every restraint stayed buckled, and nobody actually stood easy at all. Reyes ran the same threat assessment 4 times in a row, not because the numbers changed, but because running it kept her hands from finding something worse to do with the silence. 2 failures, she said, mostly to herself. They tried force, it didn't work. They tried getting inside our systems, that didn't work either. Sir, I keep waiting for the part where they try something we can't outstubborn. Maybe there isn't one, Dax said, though he didn't fully believe it, and Reyes's look told him she didn't either. Or maybe there is, and we won't know until it's already happening, same as the first 2. That's not comforting. Wasn't trying to be comforting, trying to be honest. You want comforting, ask me again after we're not currently sitting in front of 211 warships. Reyes huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. Deal. It was Tomas Rake who broke the quiet properly, 40 minutes into the lull, calling up from his gutted console with the specific, unhurried excitement of a man who had found something interesting rather than something urgent. Sir, probably nothing, but I want you to see it anyway. I've been running background captures on every transmission that's crossed our sensors since this started, just in case something useful showed up in the noise. Something did. Define useful. Their internal chatter. Not the stuff they're sending us, the stuff they're sending each other, ship to ship, that our array's apparently good enough to eavesdrop on even though it was never designed to. Most of it's encrypted past anything I can touch, but some of it's just relay traffic, unencrypted, boring administrative stuff, and boring administrative stuff has been leaking one specific detail for the last hour that I think you'll want to know. Which is, they're not just talking to each other, sir. They're talking to worlds behind them. Whatever's happening here isn't staying here, and based on the traffic volume, it's not staying quiet either. Dax looked at the plot, at the patient shape of a fleet that hadn't moved in over an hour, and felt something shift in his understanding of what today actually was. It wasn't just a fight for one outpost anymore, if it had ever only been that. Keep listening, he said. Whatever this turns into, I want to know before they do. Word travels fast even across the vacuum between star systems. Faster still when it travels along the compressed relay chains the Ashfall Dominion had strung through 11 conquered systems to keep its armada in constant contact with the tribute worlds behind it. Worlds that had surrendered the moment the Unveiling played. Worlds whose entire relationship with the Dominion had been built on the unbroken record of that surrender. Ossenrahk did not order the 9th Silence's telemetry classified quickly enough. By the time the 2nd Vanguard ship, a heavier cruiser, the judged Silence, with orders to approach at a 5th the speed and hold well clear of any debris field, reached firing range of the Coldwater, the recording of a human tactical officer laughing at the Unveiling's dirge had already reached 3 tribute worlds, translated imperfectly, subtitled by whichever board comms officer had first intercepted it, and was doing something to civilian morale on those worlds that no amount of message discipline was going to walk back. On Threll Outer Colony, a schoolteacher named Varen Osk played the recording for her class twice, because the children kept asking to hear the funny sound the frightening ship made. And for the first time in 6 years of occupation, an entire generation of Threll children learned that the Ashfall Armada could be laughed at. Varen had been 11 years old when the Unveiling first played over Threll's capital, had spent 6 years since teaching a curriculum that included, without ever quite saying so, the lesson that resistance was a childish thing outgrown along with other childish things. She had not intended to play the recording twice. The first time had been an accident. A student had found it circulating on the relay network under a garbled translation tag and asked her, in the specific, testing way children asked adults about things they weren't sure they were allowed to find funny, whether it was real. She had watched it to check, and had laughed before she could stop herself. A short, startled, entirely involuntary sound she had not made in 6 years. And by the time she noticed her students watching her laugh, it was already too late to pretend she hadn't. The second time, she played it on purpose, and watched 11 children who had grown up believing the Ashfall dominion was a fact of nature, like weather, discover. The way children discovered most important things, by watching an adult's face rather than by being told that it was not. She did not report the recording to the colonial administration, and neither, she would later learn, had 4 other teachers on Threll who had shown it to their own classes that same week. 6 years of careful, patient occupation had built an entire generation raised to believe fear was simply how the universe worked. It took one afternoon, one small human ship, and one accidental laugh in a classroom to begin, quietly, unmaking that belief. Cassin was 3 relay hops further from the Ashfall core than Threll, a colder world with fewer children and more debt, and the recording reached it not through a classroom, but through a cargo dock, passed hand to hand on physical data slates by workers who had learned, 4 years into occupation, that anything sent over the official relay network could be traced back to whoever sent it. Beric Fossa was 41 years old, had spent 19 of those years loading and unloading tribute shipments bound for worlds he would never see, and had trained himself, the way most of Cassin's dockworkers had, not to react to anything the Dominion did in front of the supervising drones that hovered the loading bays. Reaction was a liability. Reaction got logged. He had gotten very good, over 4 years, at keeping his face as flat and unreadable as the crates he moved. He was not good enough to keep it flat through the recording. It reached him during a shift break, passed by a woman 2 bays over who said nothing, only held out the slate with the file already queued, the way people had started doing lately when they'd found something worth the risk of sharing but not worth the risk of being caught explaining. He watched a fleet of 211 Ashfall warships open their guns in perfect, terrible unison. He heard the sound they made, even through a cheap slate speaker, even 4 relay hops removed from the original signal. It came through unmistakably as what it was, a long, mournful, undignified honk, the exact sound the Dominion's own recruitment broadcasts used, unedited, to remind Cassin's children what waited for worlds that resisted. And then he heard a human laughing at it, without fear, without performance, the specific unguarded sound of someone who had genuinely, entirely failed to be afraid. Beric Fossa had not laughed at anything in 4 years. He found, watching the recording a second time because his hands wouldn't quite let him hand the slate back yet, that he still knew how. He did not share it further that day. Sharing carried its own math, its own risk, and he was not a reckless man. But he found himself, over the following week, standing a fraction straighter under the supervising drone's cameras than he had in years, and when a junior overseer barked an order at him in the clipped, contemptuous cadence Cassin's workers had learned to absorb without comment, Beric Fossa said, quietly, in the local dialect the overseer didn't bother to translate, "Funny how big that fleet looked yesterday." The overseer didn't understand the words. He understood the tone well enough to log an infraction anyway, and Beric accepted the reduced ration chit that came with it 3 days later without complaint, because he had decided, watching a recording of a human laughing at the Dominion's oldest weapon, that some things were worth a docked ration and some things weren't, and for the first time in 4 years he had found one that was. Word of the recording did not need Beric Fossa to spread on Cassin. It moved the way water moved through cracked stone, finding paths nobody had built for it, and within a week 3 separate loading dock supervisors had quietly stopped reporting minor infractions they would have logged without a second thought a month earlier. Not out of any organized defiance. Nothing so clean as that. Just a slow, uncoordinated softening of the 1,000 small daily cruelties that had, for 4 years, been the actual machinery of occupation, each supervisor privately deciding. For reasons they might not have been able to name out loud, that today wasn't the day to be the one who enforced it hardest. Dominion intelligence would spend the following months trying to trace exactly when Cassin's compliance metrics began their slow, statistically significant decline, and would find no single cause, no ringleader, no manifesto, only a pattern that traced back. When the analysts finally cross-referenced it against relay traffic timestamps, to a single afternoon and a single recording of a small ship's laughter, spreading through an occupied World 1 data slate at a time. In a shape no doctrine had a name for because no doctrine had ever needed one before. Ossenrahk did not know this yet. She only knew that her second Vanguard ship's captain, third reader Volkash, had requested twice additional confirmation of the outpost's actual military capacity before committing to an approach vector, and that a request like that from a Virsy officer was itself a kind of surrender she had never had to process before. "Approve the request," she told Corvin jaw tight. "Full sensor sweep, maximum range, before anyone gets close enough for their belt to bite again." The judged silence held station at extreme range and ran the sweep for 11 minutes, an eternity, by Virsy doctrine, which prized decisive speed above nearly everything, and what it found did nothing to calm anyone down. "One corvette," Volkash reported. "Confirmed obsolete hull class, 41 years past design specification, extensively modified with non-standard components. We're reading at least 6 distinct manufacturer signatures cannibalized into a single drivetrain, which should not function and does. Crew complement, 6. Weapon systems, standard corvette armament, degraded, plus 1 repurposed industrial cutting laser rated for asteroid fracturing, now apparently reconfigured for point defense use. Marshal, this ship should not present a threat. By every metric we possess, it does not present a threat. And yet, Marshal, I have run the doctrine 17 times, and I cannot construct an approach that does not require crossing either their mining field or their weapon envelope. And every time I model the crossing, the model assumes rational, predictable behavior on their part, and nothing about this engagement has been rational or predictable." Volkash tried anyway, because caution without action was not a career, and sent a single unmanned probe drone ahead of the judged silence on a wide, looping vector meant to skirt the debris field entirely and get eyes on the corvette from an angle no doctrine text had accounted for. The probe returned exactly 11 seconds of clean telemetry before the Coldwater's sensor suite, never designed to track anything smaller than a shuttle, patched together out of 3 incompatible radar generations, by a crew that had spent 2 years compensating for what their equipment couldn't do, picked it up anyway, flagged it as a threat, and answered with the single cheapest, ugliest countermeasure available to a mining outpost. A spread of decommissioned ore marker flares, fired on ballistic arcs from the Reach's surface, each one blooming into a radiant, sensor-blinding flash, tuned to the exact frequency band the probe's optics used to navigate. It was equipment built to mark unstable rock formations for slow-moving haulers. It had never been fired at anything that could shoot back, because it had never needed to be. The probe, blind and disoriented, tumbled into the edge of the Kessler field on its own momentum and did not come back out. Volkash logged the loss, stared at the report for a long moment, and requested, for the 3rd time that hour, that Fleet Command reconsider the engagement's risk classification before committing further assets. "Marshal," Corvin said, watching the report cross the flagship's own display, "Volkash is requesting to stand down his approach entirely." "Then let him stand down," Ossenrahk said. "I would rather have 1 cautious officer alive than 1 confident one added to the list." Between the scout cruiser's disabling and the heavier ship's cautious hold, Ossenrahk tried the one tool that had never once failed her in 11 campaigns before the Unveiling itself had even been necessary. The formal ultimatum, delivered in the old ceremonial register, the words her ancestors had used to accept surrenders going back 300 years. To the commanding officer of the defending vessel, she broadcast, her voice box modulated into the low, resonant register the Dominion reserved for moments of state. You have witnessed the Ashfall Armada's strength and found it, by your own admission, a source of amusement. I extend you a final courtesy uncommon in our history. Submit your vessel and your outpost to Dominion authority now, without further engagement, and your people will be catalogued as a protected tribute world, granted the same considerations as Threl, Cassin, and the 11 worlds before them. Refuse, and I cannot promise the courtesy will be extended twice. It was, by Dominion standards, an extraordinarily generous offer. 3 centuries of precedent said no world had ever been offered protected status before its formal defeat, only after. Ossenrahk had authorized it herself, over Corvin's quiet objection, on the theory that a species immune to fear might still respond to a genuinely fair proposal. The Coldwater's reply came back inside of 90 seconds, and it was not what any protocol in the Dominion's diplomatic archive had prepared her translation staff to render. "This is the Coldwater," Dax's voice said, and underneath the exhaustion there was something that might, if Ossenrahk had known the species better, have been read as genuine bewilderment rather than defiance. "I want to make sure I'm reading this right, because it would be a real shame to start a war over a translation error. You're offering to skip the part where you try to conquer us, straight to the part where we're conquered, as a courtesy. Marshal, with respect, that's not actually a different offer. That's the same offer with better manners on it. We didn't say no to being invaded. We said no to being scared into agreeing to it. Those aren't the same question, and I don't think you've got a form in your archive for the one we're actually answering." On the flagship, Vessel Reader Thome made a small, involuntary sound that, in a virsy throat, approximated something between a cough and a laugh, and cut it off the instant he registered Corvin's eyes on him. "They rejected protected status," Corvin said flatly, as though saying it aloud might make it resolve into something that made sense. "Marshal, no tribute world in 300 years has rejected protected status. Protected status is the entire point. It is what every campaign has been fighting toward." Not for them, apparently. Ossenrahk stood very still, turning the human commander's answer over in her mind the way she might turn over a piece of unfamiliar wreckage, looking for the seam that would tell her how it was built. "He is right, Corvin, in a way I find I cannot simply dismiss. We offered them the outcome. We did not offer them the choice. To a species organized around fear as the natural order of first contact, those are identical. Submission is submission, regardless of the ceremony wrapped around it. To this species, apparently, they are not identical at all. The choice is the entire transaction. We have been negotiating in the wrong currency since the moment we arrived. Then what currency do you propose we negotiate in instead?" Ossenrahk did not have an answer yet. It would take the failure of 2 more approaches, Vesek's shattered infiltration and Volkash's blinded probe, before she found one, and even then it would come from Thome's 40-minute dive into a 9-year-old training recording rather than from anything in 300 years of Dominion diplomatic doctrine. For now, she simply logged the rejection, ordered the ceremonial channel closed, and felt the unfamiliar cold feeling in her chest deepen by another degree. On the Coldwater, the mood had shifted from disbelieving laughter into something quieter and more focused, the specific gallows calm that Dax had watched settle over this crew exactly twice before. Once during the reactor fire in their 2nd month at the Reach, and once during the 3 days they'd spent hand-rationing air after a hull breach nobody outside this ship had ever heard about, because nobody outside this ship had ever cared enough to ask. "Second one's holding at range," Reyes reported. "Big, ugly, patient, not falling for the belt trick. They're staying well clear of the Kessler field this time." "Smart," Dax said. "Damn it. There's a 3rd ship moving up behind it, smaller. Could be a boarding platform, Profile matches troop transport mass ratios. Nazari, elbow deep in a junction box she'd pulled the access panel off of without asking permission, didn't look up. They send boarders, we've got a problem. This ship's got 6 people on it, and about a third of its bulkheads don't seal properly anymore. Then we don't let them board. Dax looked at the plot, at the patient cruiser holding its distance, at the smaller ship creeping up behind it with obvious intent, and felt the shape of an idea start to form. Not a plan yet, just the outline of one. The way the outline of a fix always showed up first as a shape in his head before Nazari turned it into something that actually worked. Priya. What do we have that looks harmless and isn't? She finally looked up. Sir, that's most of this ship. I mean specifically. The salvage tug. She said it slowly, testing the idea as it left her mouth. We've got a 15-year-old tug rated for hauling ore barges, docked on the Reach's far platform. It's slow, it's ugly. It reads on sensors as pure civilian junk because it is pure civilian junk. But it's got a grapple array rated for towing objects 100 times its own mass, because ore barges are heavy, and it's got a reactor that, if I strip the safety interlocks, which I am fully certified not to do, sir, and will do anyway, can put out one very large, very short burst of directed radiation that would read to their sensors as a drive failure. A ship having a very bad, very sudden day. You want to fake a malfunction. I want to fake a malfunction on a ship they will absolutely dismiss as harmless. Get their boarding platform close enough to investigate what looks like an easy salvage opportunity, and then grapple onto it with a tow rig built to move barges 40 times its size, and drag it somewhere it does not want to go before anybody over their figures out they've been had. Reyes, at Tactical, had stopped looking at her console entirely and was just staring at Nazari with an expression somewhere between horror and awe. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? I've been bored for years, Reyes. There's a difference. Mostly. Dax exhaled, long and slow, and looked at the 6 people who made up the entire defense of Outpost Calder's Reach. Reyes at Tactical, doing math on odds that shouldn't have been survivable and finding a way through anyway. Nazari, halfway to volunteering for a court-martial for the 2nd time in her career, because it might save 11 civilians. The 4 more scattered through the ship, keeping air moving and power flowing, and the whole absurd, patchwork machine of the Coldwater alive 1 more hour past what any sane engineer would have predicted, and made the call he'd been avoiding since the first alarm. Do it. Reyes, get the civilians on the Reach into the deep shelters, now, in case this goes sideways. Everyone else, general quarters stays up. We're not out of this yet. The deep shelters at Calder's Reach had been dug 11 years earlier by the original mining concession, back when the Reach's biggest worry had been solar flares and equipment failure, not fleets. They were cramped, low-ceilinged, stocked with air and water and not much else, and they had never, in 11 years, held all 11 residents at once until Reyes's order sent them scrambling down the access ladders with whatever they could carry in both arms. D. Alvarez went down with them, not because anyone ordered her to, but because 11 civilians with no medical training and no idea what was happening above them needed someone who could tell the difference between panic and an actual emergency, and she had decided a long time ago. The same day she decided which of 2 dying patients got the last of the oxygen, that the difference mattered enough to go looking for it in person rather than trust it to a comm channel. She found Yusuf Bar, the concession's senior driller, trying to keep 4 younger workers calm by explaining, with more confidence than the situation probably deserved, that the Coldwater's crew had gotten them out of worse spots before. It wasn't strictly true. Nothing this large had ever happened at the Reach before, but Alvarez let it stand, because a comforting lie that kept 4 people breathing steady was doing more good in that shelter than a hard truth would have. How bad is it? Yusuf asked her quietly, once the younger workers had settled, his driller's hands scarred, sure, competent, twisting a loose thread on his sleeve in the one tell he couldn't seem to control. Honestly, I don't know. I know we've still got a ship. I know that ship's crew hasn't given up once today, and I've watched them not give up through worse than this. She sat down across from him on the shelter's cold floor, close enough that the 4 younger workers could hear her too, because a lie that only worked on one person wasn't worth much. I'm not going to tell you it's fine. I'm going to tell you that if it stops being fine, I'll be right here. And there is nowhere else on this rock I would rather be right now than in a hole in the ground with the 11 of you. One of the younger workers, a woman not much past 20 named Preeti Akanjo, who had signed onto the Reach's mining concession 8 months earlier specifically, because it paid enough to send money home and asked few enough questions to leave her alone, laughed, short, startled, not quite steady. That's either the nicest thing anyone said to me all year or the most terrifying, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Both, Alvarez said. It's usually both. You get used to it. Up above, Nazari had the tug's schematics spread across 3 different displays at once, muttering to herself in the specific rapid half-language of an engineer thinking faster than her mouth could keep up, stripping safety interlocks with the calm, methodical care of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how far a piece of equipment could be pushed before it stopped being useful and started being dangerous. And more importantly, exactly where that line moved when the alternative was worse. You sure about the reactor burst? Dax asked, watching her hands move. No, she said, not looking up. I'm sure it'll work. I'm not sure what it costs us afterward. That tug's not rated for what I'm about to ask it to do, and when this is over, if it's over, I'm going to owe it an apology and about 6 months of maintenance it's not going to get, because we don't have 6 months of spare parts either. But sure it'll work is the only kind of sure I've got today, sir, and I've learned to stop waiting for the other kind. Dax thought about the 11 people in the shelters below them, about 6 people scattered through a ship that shouldn't still be flying, and found, not for the first time that day, that he didn't actually disagree with her math. Do it, he said again, because it was apparently the only sentence he had left worth saying. The boarding platform's captain, a Virsey junior officer named Fourth Reader Essel, on the least glamorous assignment of a career that had, until today, been entirely glamorous, watched the human salvage tug drift and stutter on his sensor feed, and made the single worst decision of his life with total, reasonable confidence. Reactor failure, his engineer confirmed. Their drive signatures collapsing. That thing is not going anywhere under its own power in the next hour, maybe longer. Salvage or survivors? Could be either. Could be nothing. Could just be a dying engine on a wreck of a ship that was never worth fixing in the first place. But it's drifting toward the debris field, and if there's anyone alive on it, Command wants prisoners for the surrender protocol. Living proof works better than telemetry. Essel had watched, over the last hour, a scout cruiser get gutted by a mining cable, and a heavy cruiser get outmaneuvered into paralysis by its own caution, and some old, buried, ambitious part of him thought, I could be the one who fixes this. I could be the one who brings back the prisoner that makes this whole embarrassing day make sense. He brought the boarding platform in close, extended a grapple line of his own to stabilize the tumbling tug before docking, and felt his own ship shudder as something far larger and far stronger locked onto his hull from the opposite side and began, with slow, patient, unstoppable force, to pull. That's not their grapple, his engineer said, voice climbing. Reader, that's not the tug system. That thing doesn't have the mass to, something else has us. Something's towing us. I'm reading a tension load that shouldn't be possible from a ship that size. 15 years of ore barge hauling had built the Coldwater's salvage tug, a grapple rig engineered for exactly one purpose, moving things far too big to move themselves. It had never in its service life grappled anything that fought back, and it did not need to fight back now. It only needed to hold on and drag, and it dragged the boarding platform. Slowly, inexorably, exactly as it had dragged 10,000 tons of raw ore 1,000 times before, directly into the tangled, cable-strewn heart of the Kessler field, where 3 of Priya Nazari's mining drones were waiting with their own tethers already strung. It nearly cost them the tug. 40 seconds into the tow, with the boarding platform fighting the grapple line hard enough to make the whole rig groan, a coupling on the tug's own hull, never designed for a load that fought back, only for a load that simply sat there and got heavy sheared clean through. And for 3 seconds the entire tension of a warship, 4 times the tug's mass, ran straight down a single backup line that Nazari had rigged, almost as an afterthought, the week before out of cable she'd salvaged from a decommissioned lift shaft. "Backup's holding," Reyes called out, watching the tension readout climb past every number the line had ever been rated for. "Backup's holding, it's Priya. It's not going to hold, that line's rated for 1/5 of this." "It's not rated for it, it's just doing it," Nazari snapped back, both hands already moving across a console that had no business still responding, feeding auxiliary power from the tug's own reactor into a grapple motor never designed to draw that much current, buying the line another few seconds of tension it had no right to survive. "Come on. Come on, you ugly piece of junk, you've pulled worse than this." The line held. It held for the 11 seconds it took the tug's automated systems to redistribute the load across 2 secondary couplings Nazari had installed 8 months earlier for a completely unrelated reason. And by the time the boarding platform's own crew cut themselves free of the tow rather than be dragged any further into the debris field, the tug had already done its job. Aboard the Coldwater, nobody said anything for a moment except Amos Guthrie, over the open comm from the reactor room, muttering a low, heartfelt string of profanity that summed up, better than anything else that day, exactly how close the whole plan had come to falling apart. By the time Essel's crew cut the tow line free, the boarding platform had lost both of its own engines, half its sensor suite, and every scrap of the reputation it had carried into the encounter. On the flagship, Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey received the 3rd failure report in 90 minutes and sat, for the first time in a command career that had never once required her to sit still and think, in absolute silence. "Marshal," Corvin said eventually into that silence, "the tribute worlds are talking. Threll, Cassin, the outer relay stations, the recording of the human laughter has reached all 3, and it is being repeated. Children are repeating it. The Unveiling has been the Dominion's founding proof of inevitability for 300 years, and in the span of one afternoon, one outpost with 6 crew and a mining laser has made it into something people repeat to each other for entertainment." "I am aware, Corvin. What do you want to do?" Ossenrahk stood, finally, and walked to the viewport that ran the length of the flagship's forward bridge, looking out at the 211 ships of the Ashfall Armada arrayed in the dark, undefeated in 11 campaigns, currently being methodically dismantled in slow motion by a species that had responded to the single most terrifying weapon in her arsenal with amusement. "I want to understand them," she said, "before this becomes something I cannot walk back. Pull vessel reader Thome off sensors. I want everything we have on human military history, training doctrine, simulator records, anything that explains why an entire species finds our deepest weapon funny instead of frightening. There is a reason. I refuse to believe there is not a reason." Thome found the reason in 40 minutes, buried in an intercepted Human Academy training archive the Dominion's intelligence division had captured years earlier and never bothered to fully translate, because nobody had thought a cadet training simulator was worth the analyst hours. He brought it to the bridge with his inner eyelids doing the thing they did when a virusy mind had encountered something it did not know how to file. "Marshal," he said, "I need to show you a recording. It is 9 years old. It is a training exercise, run in a simulator, for 18-year-old human cadets who had not yet served in a single real engagement. He played it. Ossenrahk watched 200 simulated hulls unfold their weapons in a slow, synchronized ripple, watched a deliberately, artificially theatrical dirge roll out across a training bay full of teenagers, and watched those teenagers, trembling, some of them, visibly frightened at first, because it was, undeniably, a frightening thing to watch even knowing it was fake, slowly, one by one, start to laugh. Because somewhere in the simulator's design specification, a human engineer had built the scenario so aggressively, so theatrically dreadful, that it had crossed over into something the human mind processed as absurd rather than as a genuine threat. They built this, Ossenrahk said slowly, as a joke, on purpose, and then made their children practice not laughing at it, as training. Yes, Marshal. And our Unveiling, the single most sacred and effective weapon our species has ever developed, refined across 300 years and 11 successful campaigns, is, to this specific outpost's crew, nearly identical to a 9-year-old training joke they have all personally sat through, Thome confirmed. I believe, Marshal, that we did not fail to frighten them because they are fearless. I believe we failed because we performed, with complete sincerity, something their own culture had already turned into comedy, for reasons that have nothing to do with us and everything to do with the specific, strange way this species trains its young to withstand fear by finding the theatrical edges of it ridiculous. Ossenrahk absorbed this in silence for a long moment. Then the unveiling is finished, she said. Not just here, everywhere. The moment that recording spreads, and it will spread, Thome, it already has, every tribute world in this dominion will know that our founding weapon is, to at least one species in this galaxy, a punchline. We cannot unring that. We can only decide what we do next, knowing it. Corvette, who had said little in the last hour, chose that moment to say the thing Ossenrahk suspected she had been holding back since the ninth silence first went dark. There is a faster way to end this, Marshal, and you know what it is. The outpost has civilians, 11 of them, in shelters we can locate from orbital thermal signature in under a minute. We do not need to defeat their corvette. We need only demonstrate that we can reach the people it is protecting, and every clever trick their engineer has built will not matter, because they will surrender to save 11 lives faster than they would ever surrender to save one ship. Ossenrahk did not answer immediately, and in the silence, Corvette took the absence of a refusal as something close enough to permission. A single strike cutter broke from the formation without waiting for a direct order, Corvette's own initiative, the kind of decisive action that had made her a battle reader in the first place, and dropped toward the mining platform's shelter complex on a fast, low trajectory, designed to put a boarding team on the ground before the Coldwater could do anything but watch. Dax watched it happen on the plot with his stomach dropping through the floor for the second time that day. Rays, tell me that's not headed where I think it's headed. It's headed for the shelters, sir. ETA 4 minutes. We can't intercept, we don't have anything fast enough to beat it there, and if we fire on it over civilian ground, we could hit the shelters ourselves. For the first time since the alarm had gone off that morning, Dax felt the specific, cold, focused fear that had nothing funny in it at all. Options. Now. It was Tomas Rake, of all people, hunched over the salvage translation console he had spent 2 years nursing back to life, who found the answer, not a weapon, not a maneuver, but a frequency. Sir, the shelters have their own short-range beacon array, emergency use only. We've never had to actually use it. It's not strong enough to reach the strike cutter's comms, but it's strong enough to reach their proximity sensors if I overdrive it, and if I feed it the same resonance pattern their own unveiling broadcasts. You want to doomhorn their boarding team. I want to make their sensors think the shelter complex is already occupied by something with a broadcast signature, identical to their own flagship's command frequency, sir. It won't stop them. But it'll make them slow down and check first, because nobody drops a boarding team onto a position that might already have a virus command signal sitting on it without confirming what they're walking into. Do it. The strike cutter's sensor operator, 30 seconds from a clean landing, picked up a broadcast signature that read, for 4 confusing seconds, as an Ashfall Dominion command frequency already active on the ground below. Impossible, nonsensical, and exactly uncertain enough that the cutter's junior officer, unwilling to be the one who ordered a landing into what might be a trap or a friendly fire incident with a phantom formation nobody could explain, pulled up and held position at range to request clarification. It bought 90 seconds. 90 seconds was enough for Corvin's own comms officer to identify the phantom signal as a jury-rigged human broadcast rather than a genuine Dominion transmission. And by the time the cutter resumed its approach, the shelters had gone fully dark and silent, every external sensor and light source cut. 11 civilians sitting in the black with nothing between them and a boarding team, but a corvette that had already spent its cleverest tricks and a few thousand meters of empty rock. Marshal, Thome's voice from the sensor well had an edge in it Ossenrahk had never heard from him before. The corvette is transmitting again, not to us. To the strike cutter directly, on an open frequency they know we can intercept. It was Dax's voice again, and this time there was no humor in it at all, only the flat, hard clarity of a man who had run out of tricks and had exactly one thing left to say. This is the Coldwater to whoever's on that cutter. You go for those shelters. You're not fighting a warship anymore. You're fighting 6 people who have nothing left to lose and every reason in the world to make you regret it personally. I don't know what you'll find in the dark down there, and neither will you until it's too late to matter. Pull back, please. I am asking you, one commander to another, to pull back. Ossenrahk stood at the forward viewport for a long moment, watching the strike cutter hold at the edge of the shelter complex's sensor range, watching a battle reader who had built her career on decisive force wait, for the first time in memory, for a marshal's explicit order rather than trusting her own initiative. Recall the cutter, Ossenrahk said quietly, and did not look at Corvin when she said it. We came here to test a defense, Corvin, not to threaten children in a hole in the ground. If that is what winning requires today, I do not want it. The strike cutter withdrew. On the Coldwater, in the sudden, ringing silence after the recall order came through on an open channel, Dax put his head down against the console for exactly 3 seconds before Reyes reached over and squeezed his shoulder, once, hard, and neither of them said anything about it afterward. On the flagship, in the narrow interval between the strike cutter's recall and the Armada's slow, deliberate consolidation, battle reader Corvin stood alone in the officer's gallery behind the bridge and allowed herself, for exactly 4 minutes by the chronometer she did not look at, the luxury of being furious. She had not argued with the recall order in front of the bridge crew, because a battle reader who undermined her marshal in front of 400 subordinates was not a battle reader for very much longer, and because some distant, disciplined part of her still believed, even now, even after 3 failures in a single afternoon, that Ossenrahk's judgment had earned the benefit of every doubt Corvin had left to give it. But privately, in the gallery, with no one watching but the cold light of the Armada's own running lamps through the viewport, she let the fury sit where it wanted to sit, because pretending it wasn't there had never once made her a better officer, only a quieter one. She had lost soldiers before. Every battle reader who had held rank as long as she had lost soldiers before. It was the arithmetic of command, the cost that made the rest of the profession possible, and Corvin had made her peace with that arithmetic decades earlier, on a campaign against the Threll that had cost her 1/3 of her boarding company and taught her, in the specific unforgiving way only real losses taught anything, that hesitation killed more of her people than boldness ever had. She had built a career on that lesson. She had risen on it. And today, for the first time since that campaign, She had watched her marshal choose hesitation 3 times in a row, disable instead of destroy, hold instead of strike, recall instead of press. And something old and scarred in Corvin's chest had recognized the shape of a mistake she'd spent her whole career trying not to make again. It was not that she wanted the human civilians dead. She told herself that clearly in the gallery, alone, because it mattered to her that it was true. She wanted the engagement over before it cost the Dominion something larger than one small outpost, before the recording spreading through the tribute worlds hardened into something no withdrawal could undo. She had seen occupations unravel before slowly, from exactly this kind of small, unanswered defiance, on a border world early in her career that the histories barely mentioned anymore because the Dominion had eventually crushed the unrest there so thoroughly that crushing it became the only story anyone remembered. Corvin remembered the years before the crushing. She remembered how it had started. Small, contained, almost funny, right up until it wasn't. She did not know, standing in the gallery, that she was describing, nearly word for word, if she had ever heard the human phrase, exactly the shape of what Priya Nazari had told Dax 2 hours earlier about fear being contagious. Corvin had spent her whole career on the side of the fear. She had never had to imagine what it looked like from the other end of that contagion, watching it work in reverse. Vessel Reader Thome found her there, hesitating at the gallery's threshold in the particular way junior officers hesitated when they weren't certain whether they were interrupting something they didn't have rank to interrupt. Battle Reader. He didn't come further in without invitation. The Marshal is reconvening the bridge. She wants your assessment on the record before the Armada moves. My assessment, Corvin repeated, and something in her voice made Thome's inner eyelids flicker, the old tell of a Virsey mind bracing for something it didn't want to hear. My assessment, Thome, is that I have spent this entire engagement being right about the tactics and wrong about the outcome, and I have never in 11 campaigns had to hold both of those thoughts in my mandibles at the same time. I don't enjoy how it tastes. For what it's worth, Thome said, with the careful, unpracticed courage of a censor officer who did not often volunteer opinions above his station. I don't think the Marshal disagrees with your read of the danger, Battle Reader. I think she's decided the danger's worth carrying anyway. That's not the same as being wrong. It might just be a different kind of right than the one you were trained for. Corvin looked at him for a long moment. Thome, 3 seats down at the censor well for 11 campaigns, who had never once before today said anything to her that wasn't a number, and felt some small fraction of the fury settle, not vanish, but settle, the way weight settled when you finally set it down somewhere solid. Go tell the Marshal I'm coming, she said, and Thome, that was well said. Don't make a habit of surprising me. I've had enough surprises today. What the Ashfall Armada did next over the following 90 minutes was the thing that finally, genuinely frightened the crew of the Terran defense ship Coldwater. Not weapons, not numbers, but the slow, deliberate, unmistakable act of 211 ships beginning, all at once, to move. They're not retreating, Reyes said, watching the plot with her jaw tight. They're consolidating. Every ship in that formation is falling in behind the flagship. Sir, I think this is the part where the joke stops being funny. Dax had been awake for 11 hours, had watched his ship survive 3 engagements it had no business surviving, and felt the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had run out of clever ideas exactly when he needed one most. Options. We don't have options, sir. We've got a mining laser, 40 tapped-out drones, and a tug that can't tow anything else without a recharge cycle we don't have time for. If that flagship decides to just come in and end this, there is nothing on this ship that stops it. Then we don't stop it, Nazari said, from the engineering console, and something in her voice made both of them turn. We don't need to stop it, sir. We need to make it not want to. Priya, they've got the biggest gun in the sector pointed at us, and they just watched us humiliate half their fleet. I don't think, not wanting to, is on the table. It's not about the gun, it's about the audience. She pulled up the comms log, the 3 Tribute World relay stations that had, over the last 2 hours, quietly begun repeating and re-repeating the intercepted recordings, first of the laughter, then of the 9th silences disabling, then of the boarding platform's humiliating tow into the debris field. Sir, we've been fighting this whole engagement like it's just us against them. It's not. Every Tribute World under their control has been listening in, and every failure they've had, every ship they've lost control of, every recording of us laughing at their doom horn, that's not just embarrassing. That's contagious. Fear's the only thing holding an occupation like that together, and we've spent the last 2 hours puncturing it in front of an audience of millions. So what do you want to do? Broadcast louder. I want to broadcast honest. Nazari met his eyes, and there was nothing joking in her expression now, just the flat, clear-eyed competence that had kept this ship's air breathable through worse days than this one. Let me put together a message. Not a taunt, we've done enough of that by accident, we don't need to do it on purpose. A truth. Something that lands the same way the laughter did, except this time we choose it instead of stumbling into it. Dax looked at the flagship, closing steadily, undeniably, on a heading that left no ambiguity about its intent, and made the second worst odds decision of his career in the same afternoon he'd made the first one. Do it, he said. You've got until they're in range. Nobody on the bridge was laughing anymore. The flagship grew on the main display the way weather grew on a horizon, not fast, not dramatic, just steady and total and impossible to argue with. 7 kilometers of hull that made the Coldwater's own 80 meters look like a rounding error. Reyes kept her hands on her console because it gave them somewhere to be. Guthrie, down in the reactor room, had stopped talking entirely, which for Guthrie was its own kind of alarm. Alvarez had moved quietly through the ship checking every emergency kit twice, not because she expected to need them, but because it was the only thing she knew how to do with her hands that made the waiting bearable. Dax found himself thinking, absurdly, of the first week he'd taken command, of standing on the Coldwater's cramped bridge with a service record full of black marks and a crew nobody else wanted, wondering what exactly he'd done to deserve a posting this far from anything that mattered. It had taken him 4 months to understand that nobody had done anything to deserve it. They had all just told the truth, or made the hard call, or refused to quit, at exactly the moment when the system preferred people who didn't. He looked around the bridge now, Reyes, jaw tight, still doing the math. Nazari, already 3 steps into whatever came next before anyone else had finished processing what was happening now, and felt something that wasn't quite courage and wasn't quite resignation, but sat somewhere close to both, settle into place behind his ribs. Whatever happens, he said, quiet enough that it didn't carry past the bridge, I want it on record that this was the best posting I ever had, worst parts included. Reyes didn't look away from her console, but the corner of her mouth moved. Ask me again if we're all still breathing tomorrow, sir. Fair. The flagship kept closing. Before she gave the order to close, Ossenrahk spent 4 minutes alone in her ready room doing something she had not done before any of her previous 11 campaigns. She watched Thome's 9-year-old recording again, all the way through, not for the tactical content this time, but for the cadets' faces. She watched 140 teenagers brace for a threat their instructors had built to be unbearable, watched the specific animal stillness that came over a body genuinely afraid, the same stillness she had watched settle over her own bridge crew that morning, and then watched it break, one cadet at a time, into something that was not relief exactly, because relief implied the threat had been real and had passed. This was different. This was a species discovering, in real time, that the shape of its own fear had been designed by someone it trusted, for a reason it could someday be told, and that the telling itself was a kind of gift few instructors anywhere would have thought to give. The Ashfall Dominion trained its officers differently. Ossenrahk had been 11 years old when she first watched a recording of the Unveiling's dirge, shown to her not as a joke to be diffused, but as a promise to be believed. This is what we are capable of. This is why you need never personally know fear again, so long as you stand behind it and never in front of it. 300 years of doctrine had been built on making sure no Ashfall child ever had to laugh at the Unveiling, because laughing at it would have meant doubting it, and a dominion that doubted its own founding weapon was a dominion that had already lost something no fleet could win back. She had never doubted it. Not once, not in 11 campaigns, not until a corvette with 6 tired people aboard had shown her, without meaning to, exactly what her own doctrine had cost her. An entire species' capacity to ever find their own fear ridiculous, to ever stand in a training bay as children and decide together that a nightmare rehearsed enough times stopped owning you. She thought about what that meant for the next generation of Varsity cadets, and found she did not have an answer, only the beginning of a question she suspected would occupy the rest of her career. The comm chimed, corving from the bridge, "Marshal. We're ready when you are." Ossenrahk closed the recording, straightened the plates of her uniform in the small, unconscious gesture she had performed before every engagement of her career, and allowed herself one more moment of something that was not quite envy and not quite grief before she stood. "I'm coming," she said, and went to bring her flagship home to a decision 300 years of doctrine had never once required a Varsity Marshal to make. Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey brought the Ashfall flagship into engagement range personally, in command of the bridge, because a marshal who had led 11 campaigns to unbroken victory did not delegate the ending of a defeat, even a defeat as strange and small as this one. She would not destroy the corvette. Thome's research had made that much clear, that an outpost this poorly defended did not merit the Armada's full weight, that killing 6 people over a training simulator joke would be, in the plainest sense, an act of a species that had lost its composure. But she would end the humiliation, board the ship properly this time, with force enough that no clever cable trick or toad decoy could stop it. And she would look the human commander in whatever passed for an eye and understand, finally, what she was dealing with. She was 3 minutes from weapons range when vessel reader Thome reported an incoming transmission, and something in his voice made her pause before ordering it played. It was not a taunt. She had braced for a taunt, had steeled herself against the particular sting of being mocked twice in one day by the same small ship, and what came through the speakers instead was a young man's voice, tired, unhurried, without a trace of the earlier laughter in it. "This is Lieutenant Commander Dax Aoyama, Terran Defense Ship Coldwater, to the commanding officer of the fleet inbound on our position. I want to say something before this goes any further, and I want to say it plain, because I think somewhere in the last 2 hours we both stopped understanding what the other side was actually doing. We laughed at your ships because of something specific, not because we don't respect what you've built, or what you've survived, or how many worlds you've brought under your flag. We laughed because that particular display, the way your ships open up, the sound your ships make, it's identical, almost frame for frame, to something we build for our own kids. A worst-case scenario. The most theatrical, over-designed nightmare our own instructors could imagine, played over and over in a training simulator until 18-year-olds stop being scared of it and start finding it ridiculous instead. That's not an insult to you. That's what we do to fear on purpose so it doesn't own us. We didn't know your unveiling was real until it was already too late not to laugh. I'm sorry for the timing. I'm not sorry for the honesty. Here's the other thing I want you to know, before you decide what happens next. Every trick we've pulled today, the cable, the tow rig, the fake reactor failure, none of that is because we're brilliant tacticians sitting on some secret superweapon. It's because 6 people got sent to the worst posting in human space, with a ship nobody else wanted, and instead of giving up, We spent 2 years getting creative with mining equipment out of sheer boredom and stubbornness. That's not a fleet. That's not even much of a defense. It's just people who decided, a long time before you showed up, that they weren't going to be the ones who panicked first. Whatever you decide to do next, I want you to know exactly what you'd be spending 211 ships to beat. 6 tired people and a corvette held together with hope and salvaged parts. Not because we're special. Because we've had worse days than this one and we're still here. The transmission ended. On the flagship's bridge, 400 warships officers sat in a silence that had nothing performed about it, and Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey stood at the forward viewport for a long moment, looking at the small, battered, absurd ship still holding position at the edge of the debris field. It had used to bloody her fleet 3 times in one afternoon, and felt the last of the unfamiliar cold feeling in her chest resolve, unexpectedly, into something almost like respect. "Corvin," she said, "signal full stop. All ships hold position." "Marshal, I have led this fleet against 11 civilizations, Corvin, and every one of them broke because they believed, correctly, that we would destroy everything they had if they did not surrender. This is not that. This is 6 people who have already decided they are not afraid of us, not out of arrogance, but because whatever they have already survived to get here made our doom horn sound like a punchline. I am not interested in spending 211 ships proving a point to 6 people who have already made their point better than we could unmake it. Hold position. Open a direct channel. I will speak with their commander myself." Corvin did not argue further, though her antennae stayed rigid in a posture Ossenrahk recognized as unresolved dissent held in check by discipline alone. "And if this is exactly the stalling tactic I warned you about, Marshal, if we hold position and open ourselves to whatever they've been building for the last 2 hours while we talk, then I will have been wrong and you will have been right, and I will answer for that to the Dominion Council myself." Ossenrahk turned from the viewport to face her second-in-command directly, mandibles set in the particular configuration that Corvin, after 11 campaigns together, had learned meant the discussion was over but the respect underneath it was not. "But I have watched this crew choose, 3 times today, not to kill anyone when killing was well within their reach. They disabled the 9th silence instead of destroying it. They towed the boarding platform into the debris field instead of venting it to vacuum. They could have let that strike cutter land and then done whatever waited for it in the dark, and instead they warned it off, because apparently even a species that finds our sacred rites hilarious still doesn't want the deaths on its hands if it can help it. I have spent my career reading intentions from doctrine and formation and firing solutions. Today, I am going to try reading intentions from what a species chooses not to do when it has every excuse to do otherwise. Open the channel, Corvin." The conversation that followed was recorded by both sides, translated imperfectly by both sides, and would be studied badly, incompletely, with a great deal of academic argument about tone, for years afterward by historians on both ends of a border that would, from that day, look very different than it had that morning. Ossenrahk did not apologize, because Varsity did not apologize for acting within their own doctrine, and Dax did not expect her to. What she offered instead, in the flat, careful cadence of a language doing its best across a translation matrix that had spent the entire encounter rendering foghorns as comedy, was something closer to acknowledgement. That the Ashfall Armada had come to outpost Calder's Reach expecting the 12th surrender of an unbroken record, and had instead met something her doctrine had no protocol for, and that a marshal who had built a career on decisive action recognized, better than most, when a situation called for the opposite. "We will withdraw," she said. "Not because you have defeated us, you have not, and I want that stated plainly, because I do not deal in false humility any more than you deal in false fear. We will withdraw because I have spent 300 years of my dominion's history believing that fear was the only currency that mattered in a first encounter, and you have shown me, in one afternoon, an entire species that trains its children not to spend it. I do not yet know what that means for the Ashfall Dominion. I intend to find out slowly and carefully, and not by returning here with the rest of my fleet to make a point I have already lost. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Dax wondered if the translation had broken down entirely. When Ossenrahk spoke again, something in the cadence had shifted, less the flat formality of a marshal delivering doctrine, more the careful, unpracticed sound of a question she had not planned to ask out loud. "I have a question, Commander Aoyama, and I ask it plainly because I do not know how else to ask it. In 11 campaigns, every species we have encountered has organized itself, in the end, around the same understanding, that overwhelming force earns submission, and submission earns peace, and that is simply how civilizations survive contact with one another. Your crew has spent this entire day demonstrating, apparently without much effort, that this understanding does not hold for you. I want to know why. Not the tactics. Thome has already explained the tactics to my satisfaction. I want to know why 6 people who could have died 11 different ways today chose, every time, to warn us instead of destroy us, to disable instead of kill, to laugh instead of despair. What is it in your species that produces that specific choice?" Dax thought about it for longer than felt comfortable over an open channel with 211 warships still holding position a few thousand kilometers away. "Honestly, I don't think there's one answer, but if I had to guess, we spend a lot of our history being afraid of things a lot bigger than us, and most of the time being afraid doesn't actually help. So somewhere along the way we got good at deciding, on purpose, what we're going to let scare us and what we're not. Doesn't mean we're not scared today. I promise you, Marshal, every person on this ship has been terrified since the moment your fleet dropped into this system. We just decided a long time ago that terrified and beaten aren't the same thing, and we're not going to treat them like they are. That is a very small thing to build 300 years of failed doctrine against," Ossenrahk said, and there was something in it that might, in a better translation, have been rueful. "Maybe, but you're the one holding 211 ships at station, because 6 people wouldn't panic on schedule. I don't think it's as small as you're making it sound." "Then let me ask you something practical, since we've apparently moved past the ceremonial part of this conversation," Ossenrahk said. "If I withdraw the Armada entirely, not a stand-down, a full withdrawal, back across the border we crossed this morning, what happens to outpost Calder's reach in 6 months, when some other power decides an undefended mining claim on the rim is worth the trouble? I ask because I have spent 300 years of doctrine assuming that a world without a fleet to protect it is a world waiting to be taken by someone who does. I would like to know whether you've solved that problem, or whether you've simply been lucky once." Dax considered the question longer than he'd considered almost anything else that day, because it was, he had to admit, a fair one. "Honestly, we haven't solved it. 11 civilians and 6 burnout cases with a mining laser isn't a defense doctrine, Marshal. It's a Tuesday that went badly. If someone shows up next month with better manners and worse intentions, I don't know that we win twice." That is a remarkably honest answer for a negotiation. "I figure you've got better things to do than get lied to by a corvette commander. If Terran Defense Force Command has any sense, this report gets read and somebody with actual resources decides the rim's worth garrisoning properly. If they don't," he shrugged, though the gesture didn't carry over the channel, only the flatness in his voice did, "then we do what we did today. We get creative, we get stubborn, and we hope creative and stubborn is enough one more time. It won't always be. I know that. I'd rather tell you the truth about our odds than promise you a defense we don't have. Most species I have accepted surrender from," Ossenrahk said, "spent that portion of the conversation promising me defenses they did not have, in the hope I would believe them long enough to leave. You are the first to tell me the opposite." "Would it have worked, the lying I mean?" "No," she admitted. "But it has, historically, cost us nothing to allow them the attempt. Your refusal to make it costs me something I did not expect to lose today, Commander. It costs me the certainty that I understood the shape of every negotiation before it started. I am 40 years into a command career, and you have made me recalculate twice in the same conversation. Only twice. I feel like we're underperforming. Something in the translated cadence that followed might, if the matrix had been built for it, have carried the shape of a huff, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one, the sound of someone choosing not to dignify a joke with the reaction it was fishing for. Do not let it go to your species' collective head, Commander Aoyama. I am recalculating a doctrine. I have not yet decided I like the results. Fair enough, Dax said. For what it's worth, he went on, we're not looking for a fight either. We're a mining outpost. 11 civilians and 6 burnout cases the Terran Defense Force didn't know what else to do with. If you'd shown up asking instead of unveiling, we'd have probably just been confused, not amused. I will remember that, Ossenrahk said, for the next world. Assuming there is a manner of arriving that does not involve 4 minutes and 11 seconds of choreography, my own intelligence division now informs me is, and I quote the human phrase directly because I have no better translation, a meme. It was, Dax would later admit, the first and only time he ever heard something that might genuinely have been a joke, delivered with total sincerity, by an alien fleet marshal who had just spent an entire day losing to a corvette with a mining laser. And it was, somehow, exactly as funny as everything else that had happened that day. Which was to say, not funny at all and completely, helplessly funny anyway, in the specific way that things were funny when you were still alive to laugh at them. The channel closed, and for a long moment nobody on the Coldwater's bridge moved, the way nobody moves in the first few seconds after a storm passes, still braced for a second gust that isn't coming. Reyes broke first, the way she usually did, releasing a breath she'd apparently been holding since the flagship started closing and letting her hands fall away from a console she'd been gripping hard enough to leave marks. Did that just happen? I need someone else to confirm that just happened, because my brain is currently refusing to file it anywhere useful. It happened, Dax said. His own hands, he noticed, weren't entirely steady either, and he decided not to mention it. 211 ships held at station. By us. By 6 of us, Nazari said, arriving on the bridge with grease to the elbow and an expression that hadn't quite caught up to relief yet. And a mining laser that's going to need a full rebuild, and a tug that is never, ever going to forgive me, and 40 drones that are down to about 1/3 of their original tether cable. I want that on the record too. We won, technically, but we won ugly. We won ugly as still won, Dax said. Down in the shelters, the all-clear reached Alvarez, and the 11 civilians 9 minutes after the flagship's withdrawal order went out fleet-wide, relayed by Rake the moment he could confirm it wasn't a trick. Because after a day like today, confirming things twice had stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like the only sane way to receive good news. Preeti Akanjo cried, briefly and without embarrassment, the specific unguarded relief of someone who had spent 3 hours mentally rehearsing a version of today that hadn't ended this way. Yusuf Bar said nothing at all for a full minute, just sat very still with his scarred driller's hands finally quiet in his lap, and then asked, in a voice that cracked once in the middle, whether anyone had thought to check on the drones, because they'd been out there working the whole time, untouched, oblivious, and it seemed important suddenly that something on the Reach had gotten through the day without knowing anything had been wrong at all. Guthrie came up from the reactor room for the first time in 6 hours, blinking in light that wasn't emergency red, and found the bridge in the specific loose, exhausted disarray of a crew that had just remembered how to stand down. He didn't say anything either. He just leaned in the hatchway for a moment, taking in the sight of all 5 of the people he could currently see still breathing, and then went to go find Alvarez, because some things a comm channel couldn't do properly, and this was one of them. Dax stayed in the command chair a while longer after the others had started to scatter, watching the plot where 211 contacts were, for the first time in 11 hours, moving away instead of toward. He thought about the 11 months it had taken this crew to stop flinching at every alarm, and the 2 years it had taken them to stop thinking of the Reach as somewhere they'd been sent instead of somewhere they'd chosen, and the specific, unglamorous, entirely unrepeatable combination of stubbornness and scrap and bad jokes that had somehow, impossibly, been enough. Log entry, he said finally, to the recorder that had been running the whole time, because Defense Force regulations required a log entry, and because some part of him wanted the words on record before the adrenaline wore off and he lost the exact shape of what he wanted to say. Terran Defense Ship Coldwater, Lieutenant Commander Dax Aoyama commanding. Today the Ashfall Dominion sent 211 warships to outpost Calder's Reach expecting a surrender. They are leaving with a recording of us laughing instead. I don't have a better summary than that. I'm not sure the situation deserves one. The Ashfall Armada withdrew 4 hours later, in a formation considerably less choreographed than the one it had arrived in, and word of outpost Calder's Reach reached Terran Defense Force Command 11 days after that, by which point the recordings, the laughter, the disabled cruiser, the towed boarding platform, and Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey's own dry, unwilling near-joke about memes, had already circulated through 3 tribute worlds, 1 human border command, and eventually every academy that trained cadets on the very simulator scenario that had started the whole thing. Cold Harbor Academy added a new line to its Scenario 9 briefing packet that year, one that instructors read to every incoming class with perfectly straight faces. This exercise has now been field tested. It works. The first class of cadets to run the updated Scenario 9 did not know, going in, that the exercise had changed. That was deliberate. The instructors had argued about it for weeks and settled, in the end, on leaving the briefing packet's new line unread until after the simulation, because the entire value of the doom wave had always depended on cadets meeting it honestly, afraid first and amused second, and nobody wanted to spoil the sequence by telling 18-year-olds in advance that laughing was now, technically, doctrine. They ran it the way every class had run it for 9 years, trembling at first, some of them, in the dark of Combat Simulator Bay 4, watching 200 simulated hulls unfold their weapons in that slow, synchronized ripple, listening to a dirge engineered by a board contractor to be the most theatrically dreadful sound a design budget could buy. And then, the way every class eventually did, they began to laugh, first 1 cadet, then a ragged handful, then most of the bay, the specific, cascading, helpless sound of an entire room deciding together that the nightmare had gone on a beat too long to still be frightening. Only this time, when the lights came up and the instructor read the new line off the briefing packet, this exercise has now been field tested. It works. The bay went quiet in a completely different way than it ever had before. Field tested, 1 cadet said slowly, a 19-year-old named Priya Akafer who would, 11 years later, captain her own border patrol and tell this story to her own crew more times than any of them would ever admit to wanting to hear again. Field tested how? The instructor played them the recording, the real one, the Coldwaters, the honking dirge and the disbelieving laughter, and the 211 ships that had, in the end, gone home. Cadet Akafer watched a corvette a tenth the mass of an alien flagship do, for real, exactly what she had just finished doing in a simulator, and felt something she would spend years trying to describe to people who hadn't been in that bay. Not pride exactly, and not vindication, but the strange, grounding relief of learning that a lesson she'd assumed was only ever going to matter in theory had already, somewhere out past the border, mattered for real. So the joke worked, she said. The joke worked, the instructor agreed. Somewhere out there, 6 people who sat through this exact scenario 9 years before you did just used it to talk down an alien war fleet. I don't know what to tell you except, pay attention. You never know which parts of this job are actually going to matter. Cold Harbor Academy kept running Scenario 9 every year after that, unchanged in every detail except the one line at the end of the packet, and generations of cadets who would never fire a shot in anger carried the doom waves honking, ridiculous, field-tested dirge with them anyway. The way a family carried an old joke nobody outside the family fully understood proof, small and specific, and entirely their own, that somewhere in the galaxy, refusing to be afraid on schedule had already saved someone's life. On Threll Outer Colony, Varen Osk did not find out for another 3 weeks that the recording she had played twice in her classroom had traveled all the way to the flagship's own intelligence division and factored, in some small and unmeasurable way, into a Fleet Marshal's decision to stand down. She only knew that the colonial administration's mandatory morning broadcast, 6 years of the same tired reassurances about the Dominion's benevolent order, had gone quiet for 4 days after the withdrawal, replaced by nothing, by silence, by an absence that felt louder than anything it might have said instead. When the broadcasts resumed, they were shorter, more careful, and for the first time in 6 years, they did not once use the word inevitable. Her students noticed. Children always noticed the things adults hoped they wouldn't. The ripple did not stop at Threll. Dominion intelligence would spend the following year trying, with limited success, to contain the spread of the encounter's recordings across the tribute worlds, and would fail for the same reason doctrine had failed at Calder's Reach. There was no clean architecture to the problem, no single point of control to seize, only a few 100 million individual people who had, each in their own way, heard something that had never been possible before and decided to remember it. 3 colonies petitioned for renegotiated tribute terms within the year. One, quietly, without ever mentioning the Coldwater by name, began stockpiling its own version of mining equipment that had no business being a weapon, and was, increasingly, treated as one anyway. Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey would spend the rest of her career being asked, by nervous junior officers and skeptical Dominion counselors alike, to explain exactly what had happened at that fringe outpost with the corvette and the laughter, and she would never quite manage an answer that satisfied either the officers or herself, beyond the one she kept coming back to. That she had met a species which had already decided, long before meeting the Dominion, not to be afraid on command, and that no amount of doctrine had prepared her for how contagious that decision turned out to be. Terran Defense Force Command took considerably longer to understand what they had on their hands. The first debrief officer who reviewed Dax's report flagged it as likely exaggeration and recommended a follow-up inspection. The inspection team that arrived 6 weeks later spent 4 days combing over the Coldwater's cobbled-together systems, the tug's overbuilt grapple rig, the mining belt still crisscrossed with cable, and left with a report that used the phrase unreplicable operational culture 4 separate times, as though the 6 of them were some rare mineral vein that could not be mined twice. A senior TDF strategist, reading the full account months later, would write in a since declassified assessment that the Coldwater's crew had not won through superior technology or tactics, but through the simple, difficult fact of having already survived worse, that fear, deployed against people who had run out of things left to be afraid of, simply had nowhere left to land. On Cassin, the slow arithmetic that had begun with a dockworker's quiet aside to an overseer who didn't understand the words compounded, over the following months, into something the Dominion's own compliance analysts flagged, in careful bureaucratic language, as elevated regional risk, cause undetermined. Barack Fossa never found out that his was one of a few 100,000 small, unconnected refusals that analysts would spend a year trying to trace back to a single point of origin and fail to find, because there wasn't one, only a recording, and the particular, ordinary courage of people who had simply decided, each in their own time, that a docked ration chit was a price worth paying for standing a little straighter. He kept loading crates. He kept his face flat under the supervising drones. But he told the joke about the fleet that looked bigger yesterday to 3 more people before the season was out, and each of them told it to someone else, and none of them ever found out where it had started, which was, in its own way, the entire point. Fleet Marshal Ossenrahk Vey did not return to outpost Calder's Reach, not that year and not the next, though she would think of it, by her own later admission, in a memoir she would not publish until long after her retirement from active command, more often than any of her 11 victorious campaigns combined. She spent the months after the withdrawal doing something no Ashfall marshal had done in 300 years, convening a working group, drawn from her own staff and, eventually and controversially, from linguists and historians with no military caste standing at all, tasked with a single question that had no precedent in Dominion doctrine, not how to defeat an enemy who did not fear the Unveiling, but whether the Dominion's first contacts needed to open with the Unveiling at all. Corvin sat on that working group, not because Ossenrahk ordered her to, but because she asked to, and the two of them spent the better part of a year arguing productively over exactly how much of 300 years of doctrine could be rebuilt, without losing the parts of it that had kept the Dominion's world safe in the first place. Neither of them ever fully won the argument. Ossenrahk came to believe that Corvin's caution had been correct more often than she was comfortable admitting. Corvin came to believe, more slowly and with considerably more resistance, that a battle reader's arithmetic of loss had never actually accounted for what fear cost the worlds the Dominion ruled over, only what it cost the world still resisting. The working group's final report, submitted to the Dominion Council 18 months after Calder's Reach, did not abolish the Unveiling. It recommended instead something smaller and stranger by the Dominion standards. That first contact with any unknown species now include, alongside the ceremonial display of strength, an actual attempt at communication before the guns opened at all. A requirement 300 years of unbroken success had never once made necessary, until 6 people on a corvette held together with hope had made it, unmistakably, necessary. The Council adopted the recommendation in a vote Ossenrahk would later describe, in that same unpublished memoir, as the only unanimous decision in 3 centuries that owed itself entirely to a joke. Marisol Reyes offered a transfer back to a carrier track command, posting on the strength of a battle report that even skeptical desk officers found difficult to dismiss, discovered that the offer no longer felt like the vindication she had spent 3 years imagining. She turned it down as well, 3 days after Dax did, for reasons she found harder to explain to her old training command captain than the battle itself had been. Something about having finally found a bridge or telling a superior officer. An uncomfortable truth got her listened to instead of penalized, and not being willing to trade that for a bigger ship and the same old risk of going unheard. Tomas Rake's jury-rigged translation array, patched together from a decommissioned entertainment console and 2 years of stubborn maintenance, became, improbably, a minor object of study for Terran Defense Force communications researchers, who spent months trying to understand how a system with no coherent architecture had proven so resistant to exactly the kind of clean, doctrinal intrusion the Ashfall Dominion had thrown at it. Rake found their interest mostly baffling. As far as he was concerned, he had just kept fixing the thing that was already there, the way he always had, and he told the research team as much, more than once, in a tone that suggested he thought they were overcomplicating a fairly simple point. Lieutenant Commander Dax Aoyama received a commendation he was fairly sure nobody at Defense Force Command actually understood the context for. A formal request for a full debrief he answered as honestly as he could without making it sound like 6 people had gotten lucky 40 different ways in a row, and a standing offer of reassignment to a post with better funding, better parts, and a translation array that hadn't been salvaged from a decommissioned entertainment console. He turned it down. So did the rest of the Coldwater's crew, unanimously, without much discussion, because 6 people who had spent 2 years being the ones nobody else wanted had discovered, in the space of one impossible afternoon, that they had built something out of scrap and stubbornness and bad jokes that they were not, in the end, willing to trade for somewhere easier. Besides, Nazari said, 3 weeks later, elbow-deep in the tug's grapple rig, tuning it back down from the settings that had briefly turned it into the most effective weapon in human border space. If we leave, who's going to be here the next time somebody shows up with a doom horn? Dax, lying on his back under the No. 2 coolant manifold with a wrench in his teeth, didn't answer right away. Outside, outpost Calder's reach turned slow and quiet in the dark. 11 civilians and 1 very tired mining laser, and a corvette that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the small, stubborn reason an entire alien dominion was rewriting 300 years of doctrine. Nobody, he said finally around the wrench. That's the whole point. Nobody's going to be here except us, and apparently that's enough. Above them, the belt kept turning, the drones kept working, and somewhere out past the edge of the system, a fleet that had once been the galaxy's most feared carried the sound of human laughter home with it, unable to explain, not fully, not ever, why it had been the thing that finally made them stop.